Well, welcome to the Amherst Women's Club. Tonight is the Thursday evening series, which deals with accomplished women in the area, and they're talking about their personal journey of challenges and achievements. So tonight we are very lucky to have Dr. Khama Ennis, and she will be speaking on your personal journey, but within the context together of some of the interesting work you've been doing. I thought before we begin, I would give a little bit of your history because it's quite a remarkable history, but I need to read it. So, Dr. Ennis is a board-certified emergency physician with over 20 years of clinical experience, as well as training in acupuncture, lifestyle, and integrative medicine. She is nationally recognized as an advocate and leader in addressing health equity and structural racism in our healthcare system. Dr. Ennis has writings on health equity and has been published in the Washington Post and has been on numerous panels and podcasts. Dr. Ennis is nationally known for her narrative health equity project called Faces of Medicine. I don't know if many of you have seen that. Have you had a chance to? Her documentary, by that name, focuses on the journeys of Black female physicians with the goal of creating inspiration to deal with diversity in medicine and thereby improve health equity. Joni Fraser and I had a chance to see the film. It is really remarkable. I would encourage you to see it if you can. And I have those papers will tell you how to access it. Dr. Ennis is a graduate of Brown University, New York University School of Medicine, and a master's in public health. As if, being an MD wasn't enough. So, and that's from the Harvard School of Public Health. Dr. Emergency Medicine residency at Mass General and Women's Brigham Hospitals, and medical acupuncture training at the University of New England. Dr. Ennis has received additional training in integrative health and lifestyle medicine. So we are really thrilled to have you here today.
So thank you all for being here. Thank you for inviting me. And I am generally a fairly relaxed person, so if something pops up into your head, throw your hand up, shout out, it's fine. We're all friends tonight. So I'll tell you just a bit about my path to how I ended up here. It doesn't make sense to me because there's nothing about where I started in life, where my family started in life, that makes any of this make sense, which is great because that means I don't have to follow a rule book. So I was born in Jamaica in the mid-70s, and when I was about 2 or 3 years old, my family decided it was time to leave Jamaica because there was some significant political turmoil at the time, and they just didn't know. It was sort of the height of, the Red Scare, and so is it gonna go communist? What's happening? And so my family pulled up stakes, and one of my aunts had moved to the U.S. a couple of years before that. One of my father's friends from high school had also moved to the U.S. And so my aunt was in the Bronx, New York. My father's friend from childhood was in the Philadelphia suburbs, and he came up first to check out both areas and decided to settle outside of Philadelphia. So that's how I ended up where I grew up. And my mom is one of 11 children, and my father is one of 12. And so they both grew up in very rural Jamaica. My mother particularly rural, to the extent that, when I say that my story doesn't make sense, it really doesn't make sense. Like the first time I used a flush toilet at my grandparents' home was in my 20s. That was the first time there was plumbing in the house. So there was no running water, there was no electricity, we used a well. So when I went to visit my grandparents, we had one of those sort of ground level well, but sort of this wide, maybe like 10 by 15 foot thing, and you drop the bucket in, swish it around, pull it up, and I was always a kid that lost the rope And I was really excited when I was finally old enough to figure out how to use like the long stick with the hook on it to get the bucket back up instead of having to get my grandfather. But this is where I started. But we landed in the Philadelphia suburbs, and I went to public schools there from K through 12. My public school experience was mostly good. My first couple of years were great. There were a couple of years towards the end of elementary school that were absolutely horrible, starting in second grade when the school decided that they didn't like, I don't know if they didn't like me and my sister or they didn't like how well we were doing in school, but they couldn't make it make sense. And so to the extent that, I got notes written home about how bad I was, how I was distracting my classmates, I was talking too much. And I don't know how much you all know about Jamaican culture, but it's not like it's represented in popular media. It's incredibly strict and incredibly conservative. So to have notes sent home about bad behavior was not an inconsequential thing. And it got so bad that at the school that they decided that they were going to hold my sister is 1 year older than I am. They were going to hold her back a year because they couldn't figure out why she was getting the grades that she was getting. And I kept on getting notes about how distracting I was. And my parents finally were like, they're bored. Just give her more work to do and she will shut up. And so they had my sister and I tested. They didn't believe my scores, so they retested me without my parents' consent. But that was thankfully, despite the fact that it was a toxic environment, that's what put my sister and I on the enrichment track. That put us on a different academic track in school, and things went better from there on out, once we got out of that school. And it's funny, I had a correspondence with a friend from high school not too long ago, because he had a chance to see the documentary and reflected on, when I think about it, like when you look through our school, when you look through our yearbook, probably 10% of the kids, at least 10, 15% of the kids were Black. But your sister and you were the only ones that were in our classes, in the honors class, all the way through. And if it hadn't been for toxic people in elementary school, that wouldn't necessarily have happened. And so, but because of, having this sort of different upbringing, and also because of having a very strict Jamaican upbringing, I was quite eager to leave my house. I love my parents, they're wonderful people, they really are, but there was an incongruence there. And so when I was very active, I did all the clubs and all the instruments and clarinet and bari sax and all the things. And then there was an announcement over the overhead speaker when I was in my sophomore year of high school that said, hey, does anybody want to be a foreign exchange student? And I was like, what's that? And it sounds interesting, you get to travel, I like going places. And so I stayed after school for the meeting. And one step led to another, and I ended up doing a Rotary Foreign Exchange program that took me to New Zealand for a year. So when I was 15, I left the country. It ended up being about 11 months for my junior year of high school, and then came back and graduated. But it was nice. I mean, it was disruptive in its own way. It was an amazing year with incredible people who had no idea what to do with me. But it was nice in creating a different path for me and letting me know that I didn't have to do the thing that was laid out in front of me, because I wasn't necessarily going to fit in wherever I was anyway, so I may as well do what seems interesting. And then that followed through to college, so ended up at Brown as an undergraduate, and I knew that I was pre-med. I knew from age like 7 or 8 that I wanted to go into medicine. That was it. And it was, with the very careful thought process of a 7 or 8-year-old, like, well, people who are good and smart should be doctors or lawyers, but if I'm a lawyer, I don't know if I'm going to be defending the wrong person or prosecuting the right person or what I'm going to be doing. So as a 7-year-old, because I thought that was the only thing you could do. You're in a courtroom, and I like to argue. So So I decided to go into medicine. But as part of that, I thought, I want to go into medicine. I don't want to be a pre-med person per se, because I like a lot of other things. And so I was able to focus in medical anthropology as an undergraduate, which I feel was critical in giving me the broader understanding of the context for how most of us think about illness and wellness and health and what it actually means to receive care and to be cared for. And because I was where I was, there was no core curriculum, so I could be a pre-med student and do all those requirements, and I could do medical anthropology, and I could do a dance class elective too, which was fun. And so then, but I was very much like you've got to do the next thing next. And so there was no gap year. There wasn't much of a gap year concept at that point, and there was no gap year for me. And so I went straight to med school, but in the middle of that thought, God, I loved my med school. I had a blast. I know most people don't say they had a good time at med school, but for at least the first couple of years, I had a great time, because NYU is a really conveniently located med school. If you don't have a lot of time, you want to be in the right place. And so I worked hard, I studied hard, I made some really incredible friends. And as incredible as a med school as it was, as it went on, it got narrower and narrower in focus. And I felt like I was learning about only diseases and tests and procedures and all of these things like that, but I wasn't learning about the people who got sick and the communities where these things were taking place. And I was all about the tree and couldn't see the forest at all. And so, since I didn't have to play by the rules necessarily, because I didn't, I approached my school and I asked, is it okay? There were 2 schools at that time, 2 public health schools that were allowing students to go to do a 1-year master's degree in public health. And if you were in med school, sort of concurrently enrolled. And so I said, well, if I get into these schools, then can I take a leave of absence for a year? I know people don't tend to do this in med school, but maybe we'll see if we can. And a friend of mine and I, she went to a different public health school, but the 2 of us actually took a leave of absence after our 3rd year of med school to go to public health school. So that's when that happened. And then I came back and finished med school and went on to residency. And my plan with public health school was to focus on international health, which I did, but a lot of it was focused on infrastructure building. Like, how do we get to the root causes of why people are sick? How do we build the structures up that we need to create a space for wellness? And so it helped me. I learned a lot of those things there, and met, again, some wonderful people. And then went on to residency, which was just a beast. I can't make residency prettier. It's not pretty. It's incredible. The learning is amazing, and it's brutal, and it's better now that they have capped the permissible work hours at 80 hours a week. They didn't do that until I was most of the way through residency. So my first couple of years of residency, it was very much old school and working, I think 1 week, I think my maximum was either 106 or 113. I forget which of them it was. It made me do the math, how many hours are there there are 168 hours in this week. And I've spent, aside from going to and from every single waking one of them at this hospital. And so you learn a lot, but you also lose a lot of who you are in that process because you can't not. But I finished it and held on to enough of myself that despite being at the program where I was, which was highly academically driven program, it's the Harvard affiliated emergency medicine residency, HAMR is what we called ourselves. And it was amazing. And most people who were there wanted to work in academic medicine. And I liked the idea of bedside teaching, but I didn't love the idea of doing research. And there weren't a lot of avenues there. So I said, well, I want to work in a community hospital. I want to take care of people. That's my goal. And they were like, really? Are you? So why did you come? One of my fellow residents like, why would a person come here to go into community medicine? I'm like, because community hospitals need good doctors. Like, what do we do? Like, we all want to be well taken care of, and so the path to getting out here was actually one of my residency mentors tore off a sheet of paper from an emergency medicine journal and said, hey, the author of this article lives out in Western Mass. Give her a call. And I was like, okay. So I figured out her phone number and I cold called her and said, hi. And I'm also a little bit type A. So this is my third year of residency. Nobody's supposed to be looking for jobs yet, but I'm like, it's the third year. It's the third year is when you figure out the next thing. And so I have to figure out my next thing, especially since I'm not staying. And so I cold called this physician and she called me back and she invited me out for a visit and I visited that hospital. And she was great, but it wasn't the right space for me. And she gave me the phone numbers of some other hospitals. And one thing led to another. And then I ended up connecting with a physician who was out at Cooley. And they didn't have a job at the time, but he kept my information and said, you know, when we have a position, we'll reach out. And they did a few months later. And then I had the most absurd interview, if I can just like take a little sidestep to talk to you about that interview process. So they hadn't hired anybody new in a while. They'd never had a young woman of childbearing age. And so, in the period, like there had not been a woman physician in that department in years at that point. And so the great group of guys though, right? And so they called and the person who was leading the hiring effort said, come on out for the weekend or come out for the night and, you know, meet a couple of us. I said, great. So my then husband and I drove out. It was almost exactly this time of year because it was the weekend of the Ashfield Fair. And he said, but it was pouring rain that night. So we got out to the hospital. He said, just meet me at the hospital and we'll go from there. And so we got to the hospital parking lot. He said, just leave your car here. Come into mine. You're going to stay with me anyway. No hotel. Come on, you'll stay with me. Okay. And so we left our car, grabbed our bag, left our car, went to his car, and then he drove us to Whole Foods. I was like, okay, because he needed a couple of things. And then we went from Whole Foods to, in the pouring rain, it's dark now, it's rainy. I'm really at that point glad that my then husband was with me because we start driving and driving and driving and it's dark and the cell phone reception just like goes, and because he lives in Ashfield. And we got there, but then we pull up to this gorgeous farmhouse. I'm like, oh, okay, all right, I'm gonna relax. My blood pressure drops about 10, 15 points. And then we drove around to the back of the house, and it turns out, bless his heart, he was renting the apartment in the very back of the house because he was thrice divorced and paid a lot of alimony. Wonderful person, but brawny paper towels just everywhere on every surface. And when I looked up from that, I saw this massive gun rack and a knife rack and all like interspersed with the heads of dead animals. And I'm like, so my car is in this town that I don't know. My cell phone doesn't work. Nobody can hear me if I scream. And it's pouring rain, and what have we done? And so we take turns sleeping. But then we wake up the next day and the clouds have parted and it's gorgeous, and another one or two of the docs came over for brunch that morning and we had a great conversation, and then we drove back through the Ashfield Fair to Northampton to our car, and that was the weirdest thing I've ever had happen in a professional experience, but I took the job anyway. So that's how I ended up here. And I have no regrets, 0 regrets whatsoever, and had a wonderful career at Cooley. Did have to get them to write a maternity clause into the contract because I said, there's nothing in here about people having babies, and I'm gonna have at least one or two. So, but they wrote it in, there was no pushback. And I was able to say, you're gonna write it in so that I can take as much time as I want. Like, it was a private group, so there was no pay, but I could take as much time as I want. And so that's how we did that. And when I came back to work, I said, also, I'm breastfeeding exclusively, so I'm gonna be pumping every couple of hours when I come back, okay? And to their credit, one of them brought in a little dorm fridge and put it in the locker room for me. And I was like, that's really sweet. So I had a place to, a nice, safe, separate place to put the milk that I pumped during my shifts. But I like, I like the fact that the group accepted that they allowed that there was no pushback, and that I was able to create a precedent for other women who came into the group afterwards and did the same thing. Some chose to breastfeed, some didn't, but people had the choice to do what they wanted to do. And you know, eventually one of those two children that I had she's the one who was like, okay, Mama, I know you think you're tough and you can handle lots of things, but I'm gonna really put you through it. You're gonna go for 2 years without sleeping more than 2 hours. Let's see how you feel about that. And it wasn't great. She's very sweet, but it wasn't a great time. And so I knew something had to change because I was getting just delirious with sleep deprivation. And at that time I had to give 6 months notice. And so I gave my 6 months notice, and they were like, what are you gonna do? I was like, I don't know. I will figure it out, but it's not this, because I can't monkey around with my circadian rhythm like I am right now. I need to at least be able to sleep through the night, which in emergency medicine, you do all the shifts. It's a very egalitarian specialty, which I love, but that means that everybody does nights, everybody does weekends, everyone does holidays, everyone does all of the shifts, and you don't necessarily do them in a specific order. And then they came up to me and said, well, you know, we just did open up these 2 urgent cares, AEIOU. Do you want to run them? And I was like, I don't know how to run a thing. I know how to be a clinical emergency doc. That's what I spent my entire 20s and first part of my 30s doing. This is what I know how to do. And they said, well, we think you'd be really good at it. And I said, okay, I will try. And so just so we're clear, if it goes well, it goes well. If it doesn't, it doesn't. No harm, no foul. My feelings won't be hurt if you say like, but it went well. And so I went over to AEIOU and spent 2 years there sort of working on infrastructure, bringing in that public health learning to really bring different structures into that space. And then maybe a year and a half or 2 into that, the hospital said, hey, you know, I think we're going to be transitioning in terms of the leadership in the emergency department. Do you want to run that? And I said, no. Like, I sleep at night. I got my weekends and holidays off. What are you talking? Like, no. And then I did, and spent about 5 years in that space. And it was amazing and an incredible honor, but I spent 5 years not turning off my phone. And not having really great boundaries set up at the beginning. So, you know, when they called at like 3 in the morning and said, the department is insane, we feel like we need another provider, and I would just show up at 3 in the morning because that's what needed to be done, which is, again, not a sustainable approach to life. And so, and then I, at some point, was like, okay, well, I need to transition out of this. This is not working. My kids need me. I need sleep. And I had a few other things happen, because in medicine, we don't do a really good job of creating a healing space for the providers. And so when you have a really heartbreaking clinical outcome, there's not a really well-established path to deal with that. If you don't, because I mean, sad cases happen every day, but I had three stacked in rapid succession that I felt like the universe was just like, Khama, you've done a really great job here. It's time to move on. And so I made a plan and hired my successor and planned a whole warm pass off. So he came on in 2019. That's when I started my acupuncture training. And I was going to pass off and give him the baton officially on June 1st, 2020. Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly what happened. And so, so I didn't. I mean, I did. I was like, okay, so you're still taking this position because I'm going to turn my cell phone off for the first time in 5 years, at least at night. So I'll stay on though to help support you as we move through whatever this is. And so I stayed, and then I stayed, and then I stayed, and then I was like, no, I really got to go. In the meantime, wanted to practice medicine in some way, shape, or form, but just not in that particular form, just not in that space, and not with that schedule. And so then I found lifestyle medicine and integrative medicine, which sort of brought me back to what was probably my initial essay, my college essay that talked about holistic medicine. It talked about wanting to be a physician and practice holistic health. And it's crazy to me that that seed still remained. So then I found a fellowship that allowed me to learn about integrative medicine, and the graduation ceremony is officially a week from Saturday. But having done the lifestyle medicine training and worked in clinical emergency medicine, I did hang a shingle providing integrative medicine services last year. And this is all, but the one thing I forgot to mention, which is probably the most important part of this whole thing, is when I was deciding to leave the emergency department, when I was like, okay, I really need to make this shift, one of the reasons I stayed for as long as I did was that I was the only Black physician in the emergency department. And I was one of 2 Black hospital-based physicians, period, at Cooley. And it felt like doing a disservice to the community to leave. There are patients that I saw that were like, oh my God, I've never had a Black doctor. And like, just emotional about that, and because I don't know if it's history, I don't know what it is, but there are many people of color who don't necessarily feel welcome at all of our hospitals, Cooley included. And so it felt like, and beyond providing clinical care, providing that welcoming just energy, like, no, you can be cared for while here, because the teams there are incredible, just to be clear. I know the wait times are not great, but the teams are incredible and the care is wonderful by and large. But I felt like I couldn't leave. And then at some point I realized I couldn't stay. And when we think about root causes, for me, it sort of brought in public health and anthropology and everything else I've ever thought about. The root cause of this is that there's not enough of us. So because I was the person in charge of hiring, I was the chief of the department. And so if I couldn't hire somebody, who could? And so then I'm like, okay, there's nobody to hire. And then I started to look at the numbers and I realized that, gosh, only 5.2% of physicians in this country are Black, compared with 13.7% of the population. I think it's, for Latinx physicians, I think it's 5.8% compared with 19.3% of the population. For Indigenous physicians, it's 0.3% compared with 1.3% of the population. So gross underrepresentations with real impacts on outcomes, very real impacts on outcomes. Beyond, the differences that we see in terms of social determinants of health and socioeconomic variables, once you control for all of those, diversity in teams still makes a difference. And so I thought, well, how do I fix this? And I was like, there's got to be something someplace where this work is being done, something to show the stories of people of color in medicine. And I looked for something about Black female physicians, and I couldn't find it. And I was like, oh God, does this mean I have to do it? So I initially decided I wanted to collect stories, and the stories of Black female physicians, because not everybody has the same tunnel vision that I do. And not everybody has the same, double-edged sword challenges that I had early on that sort of said, oh no, you're a smart kid, so you should go do this thing. And not everybody has parents who are going to say, like, I don't care what you do when you grow up, as long as you get A's, you're fine. And I wanted people to be able to see themselves represented in stories. And so my plan was to collect the stories of Black female physicians from different backgrounds. So some like me, some completely different. People who were the first in their family to go to college, people who were second generation physicians, people from different parts of the country, because this is a national story, it's not just here. And I was going to collect them and put it into a collection of mini memoirs, like an anthology. And then I wanted to record them, and so I called somebody and I said, how do I record this with decent quality? And they said, well, this sounds like a documentary. And I said, crap, it does. And that was truly the beginning of this project of Faces of Medicine, which started about 3 years ago, and has just sort of snowballed. And so because I was quitting my job, and also had only just finished paying off my school loans the year before, in 2019 I finished paying them off. I said, well, I can't bankroll this. Like I got nothing. And so so it became clear that I would need to figure out how to fundraise. And so my partner said, okay, who was an artist, said, this is how you create a fundraising space, and you get fiscal sponsorship, and you create an LLC and you get fiscal sponsorship, and then you email people. I was like, I don't email anybody and ask for anything. That's not, like, I don't ask for things. But I did. And the second that first donation came in, I was hooked. And said, all right, not hooked on fundraising, but hooked on, like, okay, this project is gonna happen, come hell or high water, like we're gonna get this done. And so that is the project that started, and that's how it started. And at this point, we've interviewed 17 physicians, did a focus group of undergraduates, and an educator who told the story of the first Black woman to earn an MD, which happened in 1864 at the New England Female Medical College, which has since morphed into Boston Medical Center. And she was the only Black woman to graduate from that program. But so started fundraising to collect the stories, to pay for camera crews and really professional level production, because we wanted it to be something valuable to folks. And so we've got the first episode created and have been doing screenings since last fall, and doing educational screenings now as well, and working on spinning some of the interviews into podcast and fundraising to create the remaining episodes. So I hope you have a chance to watch it, because the goal was really to humanize us, both for young people who may not have seen themselves represented, for people who are already in the space where often we're called on to, sometimes we call it a diversity tax, where like you're doing your job and then you're called on to answer the questions on behalf of all Black people everywhere. And also just to create a window into lives. So it's really, I think this is an educator I know used the phrase windows and mirrors. Like, I want it to be a mirror for some folks, and I want it to be a window for everybody to gain access to these stories, because just the way our culture and history shape up, that space isn't always there. And physicians in general, we don't always have access to the backstories that make us human as well. And so I wanted to create that in the broad context, and specifically in this one, and hopefully with increasing representation in medicine, impact disparities and improve outcomes for all. So it's very much a long game project, but that's what I'm doing. And that's how I ended up here. So I think that's it.